So the budget update I have tonight is going to look at this year's final budget projection. In Novus, you have the final budget package. I don't expect to make any changes to that for the June 25th recommended final budget. We will go over the changes since mid-year to final for this year. And also in Novus for the board, you have the working draft of budget balancing actions. So historically, we've shared this in person, usually in a piece of paper. So I provided this to the board. It is still confidential in process because some of the items on there we are working through. But this also shares with you what is planned for being included in next year's budget and beyond. And then we are going to look at some of the scenarios we are working on for the original budget for next year. So moving on for this year's final budget, this particular slide shows everyone the original, the mid-year, and the last column is today's date with the latest. The most significant change, if you go to the general fund balance end of year row, the decrease from mid-year till now includes a $700 per pupil reduction, because at this point, we do not have any better information from the state or the feds on any monies that may help offset that shortfall that the state has in the school aid fund budget. So $700 per pupil, which is about $3.9 million, is included in this year's final budget recommendation. And I don't know whether we will hear anything in the next 10 days before I have to give you a recommendation for June 25th. The end result in the bottom right corner is 18.5% fund balance. The next page, there are 2 pages that go through the changes since mid-year. We started mid-year with revenue over expenditures of almost $600,000. And then we have a couple of key changes right off the bat. Local revenue with the shutdown eliminated revenue for rentals and preschool, different things like that. Us actually charging for bus charters, but most of that's rentals, and preschool is the largest one, just over $1 million. And then the next item is, I already mentioned, $3.9 million. I see I do have a typo in there. That's supposed to be 5,554 and a half FTEs. So I'll correct that for June 25th. That's very close to what Paul was just sharing as far as the historical data on FTEs, and that is how we are paid. The CARES Act and FEMA, I'm including that line, even though there's no net impact, just to share with you the amount of revenue so far offset by expenditures. And we continue, FEMA is actually a 75% reimbursement. We don't have word on that. We continue to collect the cost. So we are very closely watching for any opportunities we have. Medicaid reimbursement, additional funds, that actually lags behind just based on reporting. And so we're still collecting monies from 2018. That's just the way the world works with Medicaid reimbursement. IDEA increased funding is actually extra funding for existing expenditures. So that did have a net impact this year. And then staff compensation, I broke out 2 bullets because I wanted to show you the salary and wage decrease, which we would expect just based on some of the hourly and different positions that weren't paid, and also just better than the mid-year estimate, as opposed to the benefits, which is additional cost, because we wait till the final budget to look at everyone's elections and how the hard cap change affects the budget, and it was an increase this year. So between that and every year we have some UAL adjustment, the net effect is actually a negative impact of about $151,000. And then on the next page, we have some items, most of which, actually all of which are, I would say, primarily attributable to the shutdown and COVID. We did save on utilities, as we would expect: gas, electricity, and water. And I know Brian and his team, worked hard along with, IT, making sure things were shut down. And those savings are a result of a lot of those efforts. Fuel, gas, oil, and grease, think transportation, buses, and even the other vehicles that we utilize. There's a savings there. Supplies, a lot of those supplies in physical plants, even custodial cleaning supplies, and district-wide by building, there was a net savings. And then lastly, a large amount for purchases, contracted services. The majority of that will be custodial. I think that was 200 and some thousand, maybe approaching 300, and then also use of subs, conferences that were canceled, things of that nature. And that brings us to the $3.1 million loss that we're projecting this year. That includes that $3.9 million reduction of $700. The next section I have is the development of the budget for next year. And first are the millage rates. So millage rates every year are developed, and actually the board in consent agenda a couple of meetings ago approved me to finalize those and get those to our municipalities. The clerks and the county really appreciate getting this in time rather than scrambling for the July 1 levy, since we levy 50% of our taxes in the summer and then 50% for the December 1 levy. The non-homestead 18 mills is part of our general operating along with homestead. And I'm still using the old terminology, non-homestead and homestead, but now it's actually primary residence and non-primary residence is more of the technical term, depending on if you look at your tax bill. The hold harmless is the homestead, that's the 6.9091. Commercial property is just a small amount, and then all classifications of property pay debt service, which right now is the high school bond, as well as the sinking fund that was approved in May of 2018 as a replacement. One thing I like to mention, it's not noted here, is the sinking fund is subject to Headley rollback. So the replacement mills that were approved, 0.7165, because the total revenue we would collect next year is increasing greater than inflation, we're forced to roll back the rate. So that way the additional revenue we collect doesn't exceed inflation. And that's a permanent rollback. We don't get that back. Other than that, I was going to also mention the asterisks that are on here. The hold harmless rate in particular is a flat amount per pupil. It's almost $4,000 per pupil, and times FTE for the enrollment. Since we don't know our final enrollment until October, we actually revisit with the best numbers we have in September for the December 1 levy. But it's always looking at that flat, about 4,000 per pupil times the FTEs. It's capped, not changed since Proposal A passed in 1994. And every year at this time, we actually look back a year. And if we over or under levied a little bit, then we adjust the rate. So we're never collecting more than that almost $4,000 of hold harmless per pupil. Thanking all of our residents and taxpayers for continuing to renew that when we come back to them. General fund assumptions, these are in process. There are key considerations, and we're working on, unlike other years, I'm working on 3 different scenarios that I plan to bring to you: a best, a middle, and a worst. The middle is what I am targeting for a recommendation. So right now, these aren't written in stone, but based on the CRESA projections, as Paul mentioned, it's based on birth rates, it's based on coming back to school, being able to count all of our children, regardless of how they are learning, whether it's virtual, hybrid, in person. That would be the best scenario that I would use for enrollment. The middle is going to be maintaining or slightly decreased right now, the way I'm looking at estimating, and a worst would be maybe taking a 25% or 20% decline in enrollment. So these are the decisions that are in process in order to show you different scenarios, and then ultimately have a budget recommendation with the multi-year forecast, obviously before the 25th. Foundation allowance per pupil, that is going to be key. So this year, the budget shortfall at the state level is estimated 650, 700, numbers right around there continue to be tossed out. We don't yet know what the state will decide as far as use of their rainy day money. They are allowed to use some of those. We don't know if some of those will be used, some of the monies will be used for the school aid fund. We don't yet know if additional federal funds will come to help the shortfall due to COVID. And we don't know whether any of the state's decisions on helping with budget balancing actions will positively impact that shortfall as well. So I'm hoping that the $700 is the worst case. And in these scenarios, the best case for us would be that all of the reduction that we're taking in this year, and we're almost to the end of June, would be recovered next year with no new reduction. And that might be a little optimistic, but it depends. It depends between federal money but during the recession, we had federal money coming in to offset the shortfall, so we don't know. And then in the middle, I'm looking at maybe recovering half of that next year. So we would maintain that hit this year and then get half of that back next year perhaps. And the worst would be no recovery at all. And we have 2 years that we're living with that reduced revenue amount. I already went through that one. Let me see. On the local revenue side, depending on where we are as far as reopening and starting to resume activities such as rentals. I know we talk about indoor rentals, outdoor rentals, maybe outdoor might happen before indoor. So depending on where we're at, I have a best, middle, and worst because there's a good chunk of our local revenue that was impacted by canceling everything. And so perhaps depending on those different levels, we're looking at that as well. We also have our farm and nature center that operates primarily for learning. They're gems in our community and really enhance learning and instruction for our students. But at the same time, we've recognized that there are many different community program type opportunities for our residents. And so those operate a little separate from what we use those properties for education. And perhaps, you know, we as time goes and we know more, we might be able to offer usage for some of the programs on those properties. Federal funding is the biggest unknown. So I'm very curious to see what happens by September. There will be another revenue estimating conference in August that I'm hearing about, and so we'll know more then. But obviously it's after the budget needs to be adopted. On the expenditure side is more of under our control. A lot of, obviously we're a people organization, so staffing is subject to bargaining for the majority of all of our staff, and most of those are in process, not yet ratified or approved, so it's nothing that I am putting in here. I know we've had a closed session on negotiations, and more will be discussed in probably another one. The retirement rate is, and the healthcare cost changes are not under our control as much as everything else. So we have a good chunk of costs that are not staff related. And so we're looking really hard at that. And some of those you will see in that budget balancing list. That's a confidential draft in process for you to review and ask questions about at a future point. Then if we go to the next slide. So the next steps for the June 25th board meeting with documents available in advance is to finalize the original budget detail package, which is going to look very much like the final one that's included in Novus tonight, but for next year for general fund and all special revenue funds. Finalizing those forecast scenarios and also preparing the public hearing presentation with the tax rates as required by law. And that'll be a special presentation at the beginning. And then we have transparency requirements, and we use, there's a Munetrics fiscal score, so I'll be analyzing the impact of all of this on the score. Many Michigan school districts I know and the colleagues I've spoken with are very concerned about what may or may not happen with funding. And that's all I have. I will turn it back to you for questions, comments.
Yeah, I have a question before I go to, I know Howard has one. So Tina, what we're going to be approving, assuming nothing happens, is it going to be with a $700 reduction? And is that what other districts are doing that need to approve the budget? Is that a best practice? I'm just trying to understand what are we going to be approving in terms of a budget. I know you've given us, which is great, different scenarios, just for our benefit. What do we need to approve, and what's the best practice?
So on June 25th, you will be approving the final budget for this year, and that is where $700 per pupil reduction is included, because it's this year's state budget that has the shortfall. As far as the best practice, I have had more than numerous calls with MSBO and colleagues as well, and the majority of everyone best practice is including that this year, because the state has to fix that shortfall. They cannot accept or leave a deficit budget. So
Okay.
the option they have, absent anything, is to just do a proration. That's one option, and it would impact us this year.
And so other districts, you're saying, is going to use the $700 per pupil reduction based on guidance, and that's what people across the state, as a general rule, as a best practice, are going to be adopting.
The majority of everyone I'm talking to is 600, 650, 700, all in that ballpark. And then there are some that I think don't want to take their general fund into a deficit, and they're hoping something happens and they're doing it next year. But those are very few. So I'm just letting you know, I've seen it across the board, but the majority are doing what we're doing.
Okay, great. Thank you for getting doing that research for us and doing a best practice. Okay, I'll go. It's Howard, then Jennifer. Howard.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm sorry. Thank you, Tina, for presenting. So you just mentioned that based on what you're hearing from MSBO, that it's possible that there's going to be a flat proration. All districts get the same amount of money taken out of their budget, similar to what happened in 2012, correct?
Yes, that is what I'm hearing. On the last big call we had, that is where we are at.
So is it possible, though, because again, proration comes through the Department of Treasury in Lansing, but is it possible the legislature would do a negative categorical?
Yes, that is a possibility too. We don't know how it'll happen, so I just call it a $700 per pupil reduction in some form.
Because, not a category. I used the wrong word. A negative supplemental. Because
negative supplemental. Yep.
If they do a negative supplemental, they might, and that's up to the legislature and the governor, they might give a negative 2x. And if they do a negative 2x, while the average is 700, we might be hit harder, possibly even double what the average is. Is that a possibility?
Howard, that is also a possibility. That's not where the majority have landed, including those that would be impacted by 2x, but you are correct. That's a possibility as well.
So has that discussion, especially amongst the hold harmless districts and the districts that are above minimum foundation allowance, have you had any discussions with those districts? I understand, because the vast majority, 80 to 90% are at the minimum foundation allowance, but the ones that are above minimum foundation, in particular the hold harmlesses, have you had any conversations with those districts or MSBO in terms of whether that's a possibility, and if it's either a possibility or a likelihood? I would say we should take the more conservative approach in our budgeting numbers.
Are you suggesting a $1,400 decrease?
I don't know. I'm just saying, if it's a possibility, you through your network of people talking and just seeing, is this?
I think I'm comfortable, Howard, personally, and with what Tina has done in terms of a best practice in terms of 700. I'm not interested in making up hypotheticals when we have no idea what's coming down from Lansing.
But and Paul, that's fine. You were one opinion out of 7. Is it possible, Tina, maybe that Pat or you or someone can talk to Senator Baer, Representative Manoogian, and just see if
Howard, I have talked to Senator Baer and Senator Manoogian. They have no idea what the number is going to be. Tina is probably closer to the number than they do in terms of how
Okay.
it's going to trickle down to our district. I've had numerous conversations with Senator Baer and Mari about that specific topic. I think Tina is closer to it than they are. I'm just saying
All right.
right now.
I will go with whatever Tina suggests for the final budget. I just want to, for the record, say that I am concerned that a across the board reduction might not be the worst. $700 is a huge hit, much bigger than we had in 2012. I think that was $470, and that was very painful. But if the legislature gets involved and starts impacting the hold harmless districts more, we need to be prepared for that event or that possibility. I wouldn't say we put it in the budget, but I just say we should consider that as one of our scenarios going into the fall.
All right. Thanks, Howard. Jennifer?
Okay, thank you, Tina. We're going to shift gears to 101 land here. You had given us after the meeting on May 15th. I forget the name of the meeting that you had with other financial persons. That's when this 700 number got incorporated. Then I thought I had heard that the state had walked that back and was considering not having a school aid cut for 2019, 2020. Is that mistaken information? But
So based on everything, and many of my colleagues, especially in all corners of the state, were on a listserv, and everyone continues to ask that clarifying question. And it is this year that the state has the shortfall. They have to do something. So it is this year that has that impact, absent no other action. So everyone is just anxiously awaiting more actions, but it is this year's budget that has that shortfall, and they cannot cover the expenditures that were planned this year. So it is 1920.
Can you remind me what exact date the state budget, what's their end of year, beginning of year? Is that early August?
So the state year is October 1 through September 30th.
Okay. Okay, so when we see this year, the state is talking about their expenses through September 30th.
Yes, and it flows with the cash flow payments to schools, where this year's majority of our revenue is foundation, and this year the October through August payments, we get our payments beginning October through August, nothing in September. So in the last month of their year, there is no payout to schools. So we still have a July and August state aid payment coming to us, even though our school year is done, because it's following their fiscal year.
Right, okay, and
So,
we anticipate that's going to be slashed because they have no new information about their funds, say from the federal government.
Yes, federal government, we haven't heard anything on their own budget balancing efforts that may or may not help the school aid fund. And they also have a rainy day fund and are allowed to use up to 25% of it, but we don't know how they're going to use those money. Will some of that help the school aid fund? We do not know yet.
Okay. All right, thank you. One other question. In the beginning of your presentation, you had enrollment at 54 or something, which is what I understood our enrollment was. I know Paul has left our meeting, but his numbers were more at 5,300, 5,200. Are we anticipating a drop of, say, 100-ish students, or is he just coming at this from a different set of numbers?
He was presenting general ed numbers, and so my numbers include all of the FTEs that we are paid for. And you're right. So if I round without that decimal, it's 5555. Easy to remember. That's the June status report has that. I doubt it'll change by August. And Paul is looking at general ed only, and mine includes special ed.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat room.